Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is June 16th, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about the Registry of Memory, why every empire tries to rewrite the past. Now, we're going to talk about memory. Not the memory inside your mind, but the memory of civilizations, the memory of nations, the memory of faith, the memory of humanity itself. Most people assume history is simply the record of what happened, yet we are taught that historians gather facts, organize events, and present them to future generations. But history is far more complicated than that. Every generation inherits stories from the generation before it. Those stories become identity. They become culture. They become law. They become religion. They become the lens through which people understand themselves and the world around them. Now, if you can influence what a people remember, you can influence what they believe. If you can influence what they believe, you can influence how they live. Now, this is why memory has always been valuable. Long before there were computers, long before there were printing presses, and long before there were libraries filled with books, memory was considered sacred. Entire civilizations relied upon oral traditions to preserve their history. Genealogies were carefully maintained because a person's lineage determined inheritance, authority, and identity. Ancient scribes devoted their lives to preserving records because they understood something many modern people have forgotten. The survival of truth depends upon the survival of memory. And when we looked throughout history, a pattern begins to emerge. Every empire that rose to power eventually discovered that controlling armies was not enough. Controlling wealth was not enough. Controlling territory was not enough. To secure power across generations, they needed to control the story. They needed to determine which events would be remembered and which events would be forgotten. They needed to decide which heroes would be celebrated and which would disappear. They needed to determine what future generations would learn about the past. Now, this pattern appears again and again. Conquering kings destroyed monuments erected by their enemies. Dynasties rewrote official history to legitimize their rule. Libraries burned during wars. Records vanished during political transitions. Religious disputes resulted in certain texts being preserved while others disappeared. Sometimes these events occurred through deliberate action. Sometimes they occurred through neglect. Yet the result was often the same. The registry of memory became smaller, and the future generations inherited only fragments of what once existed. Now, the Bible repeatedly warns about this danger. One of the most common commands found throughout Scripture is the command to remember. Remember the covenant. Remember the deliverance from Egypt. Remember the law. Remember what the Lord has done. Memorial stones were established so children would ask their parents why those stones stood there. Feasts were observed so future generations would remember events they never personally witnessed. The biblical worldview understands that memory is not optional. It is essential. People who forget their history become vulnerable to repeating the same mistakes. So, what makes this topic especially important today is that humanity now possesses more information than at any point in history. We carry libraries in our pockets now. We can access records from all around the world within seconds. Entire archives exist in digital form, yet, despite this abundance of information, many people feel less certain about the truth than ever before. Now, the problem is not lack of information. The problem is knowing which information can be trusted. For the first time in human history, records can be altered globally in an instant. Images can be generated. Voices can be replicated. Documents can be modified. Search results can prioritize some information while burying other information. The battle over memory has not ended. It has simply entered a brand new phase. And perhaps the greatest irony of the modern age is that while we possess unprecedented technology to preserve information, we may also possess unprecedented tools to manipulate it. Future historians may not struggle because records are scarce. They may struggle because records are abundant, but authenticity is uncertain. The challenge may no longer be finding information. The challenge may be determining what is real. Well, tonight's episode is not about proving a grand conspiracy behind every missing book or every historical disagreement. History is far too complicated for simplistic explanations. Instead, we are going to examine a reoccurring reality that spans centuries and civilizations. Power consistently seeks influence over memory. Sometimes that influence is very obvious. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's even justified. And as you know, sometimes it is corrupt. But the pattern remains remarkably consistent. And as we move forward through this discussion, I want you to consider a simple question. If someone wanted to shape the future, what would they need to control today? Well, most people would answer money, governments, armies, or technology. Well, those things certainly matter. But before any of them can endure across generations, a story must be established. A memory must be preserved. A narrative must be accepted. The future is often built upon whatever version of the past that people choose to remember. Because in the end, memory is more than just history. Memory is identity, testimony, inheritance. And if every empire eventually seeks to control memory, then preserving truth may be one of the most important responsibilities entrusted to any generation. Well, tonight we examine the registry of memory, and we ask a question that has echoed throughout all of history. Who benefits when the past is rewritten? Looking forward to tonight's show. Shout out to everybody on the live chat rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion says, hey, Pastor and Warrior family, glad to be back. Hope you enjoyed the time away. Thank you, Scorpion. I did. And thanks for reminding me. I just want to give a shout out to Urban, my buddy Josh, for filling in for a week for me. Josh, you are amazing. I love you, buddy. Thank you. And thank you for being here, Scorpion, number one. Number two, Warrior is Robert Gertison. Robert says, hey, y'all. Hi, James. Grateful to be here. Let's learn about the history of knowledge. Amen to that. Thank you, too, as well, for being here. And now, breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
Well, apparently Collins will face off Senator Ossoff in the Georgia results. Who gives a shit? Breaking down the billions Iran could receive under Trump's deal. And don't listen to the people who are saying that Iran nixed the deal and are blowing up American ships. No, the deal was signed. It's done. Which is interesting because we as America could have obliterated that country easily. We could have taken them out. And yeah, a lot of historians and a lot of military buffs all say, oh, no, that's, no, come on, dude. Iran was dying anyway. We could have taken it completely over in one night, just we did in Venezuela, which, by the way, over the weekend, we had to do another excursion in Venezuela and blow shit up in order to make sure that they're not going to do that deal with China again, because, well, the new regime that's controlling Venezuela just can't help but be blackmailed by China. And we'll see what happens. But regardless, what happened was the big boy on the block took over the block again. Now, how long this new thing is going to last, I don't know. But I do know it's divided between two entities. One is the West and one is the East. We know this because Canada decided to line up with China instead of America and literally cut off everything from America. Well, not completely, but enough to hurt them bad and rely on China just to survive because, well, Canada's not as big as China. And Canada just so happens to be our neighbor upstairs and could potentially soon be our enemy. We'll see what happens there. Flight tracking data shows B-52 took sharp turn before crashing. A B-52 bomber is not the B-2 bomber. Okay? It was at an airfield. It was a crash. And these... the B-52 started flying in 1950. Everyone thinks that it's the B-2, the stealth bomber. No. They're just dicking around. And it blew up. It's an old aircraft. Why are they worried? It happens. Obama Presidential Center opening performers include Bruce Springsteen, you know, the boss. What's interesting is Bruce Springsteen, the boss. Wasn't he like a conservative? He was an American for the country, you know. Remember, he was wearing tight jeans and wearing a trucker hat and saying, "I'm an American," and yet he's a freaking commie. What? Way to go, Bruce Springsteen, living up to your morals. I get it. Because you had to sell your soul to the devil to get rich and famous. And that's the price you pay, being a complete hypocrite. Trump said no taxpayer money would be spent on the ballroom. And he said that, and it still hasn't been. And they're building a data center underneath it because they're going to track all movement and metadata of all information of people coming in and out of it. And it could also be for protection. Who knows? But we do know that a data center is being built under it. And maybe, you know, this is going to be what's the AI is going to be running the White House. We don't know because they don't tell us. And Trump offers a Ukraine olive branch at G7 with a price tag. And I'll give you an olive branch. Meanwhile, we've still been giving them weapons, money, just to keep up with this absurd war between Russia and Ukraine. Everyone knows that Ukraine couldn't possibly win something like this against that giant. But it is unfortunate. Bunch of bullshit. Lies and murder. That's what Baal and Moloch want in order for you to keep your riches. Kill, kill, kill. All right, when we come back, we're going to explore history with the Registry of Memory, why every empire tries to rewrite the past.
Paying federal income tax is voluntary. So why has every person you know done it their entire lives? You were told it's the law, but the system was built on a lie hidden in plain sight, that you are required by law to pay. The truth is, 98% of Americans don't owe income tax by law. Federal income tax is for federal employees. For everyone else, it's voluntary. You agreed to pay when you signed your first tax return, and you've been renewing that contract every year since. Sounds too good to be true? You're asking, why doesn't everyone know this? Because almost everyone signed before they were old enough to understand it. It's time to unlearn the lie and break free from IRS jurisdictions, protect your assets, and keep more of what you earn legally. Visit unincorporatedisassociations.com now and become tax-free.
All right, guys, we're back. Listener Elf Support asks a question. Says, James, what is that gray circular thing on the wall by your orange-brown guitar? Looks like a roll of duct tape stuck on the wall. Lowell. That's LOL. I like to pronounce it. I'm surprised it's taken you guys that long to find out what in the hell that thing is. Well, I'll tell you. This is my shed outside of my home, which I converted into my studio originally to sit out here, watch TV, and smoke cigars, which I did for a very long time. Until about 4 years ago when I decided to quit smoking cigars. And believe me, cleaning this whole thing was a nightmare when I smoked at least 2 to 3 cigars a night in the smoke shack. Now, with the smoke shack, I needed some sort of a cleaning device that could clean the air while I'm in here smoking because it was just nasty. And I ended up buying a smoke machine from an old restaurant in Idaho, which I believe originally was there. They go from like $5 to $10 for this smoke eater in a restaurant, right? This is when Idaho just passed a law, no more smoking, and they had it sitting in this basement. I bought it for $800, drove up there, grabbed it, came back down, installed it in my smoke shack. And with it, I incorporated a device that pulls the smoke out and pushes it outside. So it was eating the smoke, but then pushing it outside. And at first, I thought it was going to eat the smoke in without having to drill holes in the walls to make a vent, and that did not work. I don't even know if this thing ever really worked properly to begin with because the place smelled like shit. But after I removed the smoke eater, I had this thing sticking out of the wall, which I had just plastic taped around it for a while until I decided to put a cap on the ventilator. It's just a ventilator that goes outside, and I didn't want to drywall it. I just put a cap on it and left it. That's it. That's the mystery. Mystery solved. And to clean out this whole thing from all that was a pain in the ass. I had to rip out all the carpet, and I had to scrub the walls, all the just tar and nicotine that was just ages of tobacco just running through these walls. And then I used an industrial ozone generator that does warehouses, right? A buddy of mine, he actually builds them for a living. He creates them. And he let me borrow one of his, and I put that in here. And what the ozone does is it latches onto the tar, eats it up, and spits out oxygen, apparently. So ozone is a wonderful cleaning agent. You just can't breathe it in. It's not good for you to breathe in ozone. But that's how I cleaned this up, put in new carpet, repainted. I also did some sort of some kind of a chemical that I had to use on the walls to kill it off as well. But it was a pain in the ass. It was gross. But It looks better in here now. And then I just have this backdrop. It's just a shed. It's got a small roof. It's really tiny. And I just do this because this is where I do my shows, and I'm not going anywhere else. This is it. This is what I do. So there you have it. All right, so done with that question. Let's get into the registry. The first, which tonight we've been talking about the registry of memory, why every empire tries to rewrite the past. Now, long before there were nations, libraries, governments, or universities, there was memory. And we were really good at recording shit in our head, believe it or not. Not anymore, but we were. And humanity's first records were not carved into stone or written on parchment. They were carried by living people. Parents taught children. Elders taught the young. Stories were repeated around fires and passed from one generation to the next. And the earliest registry of memory was not a building filled with books, it was the family itself. Every generation became responsible for preserving what had been entrusted to them. The book of Genesis reflects this reality in a remarkable way. Modern readers often skim past the genealogies, viewing them as lists of difficult names with little relevance to daily life. Yet to ancient people, genealogies were among the most important records that they possessed. They established identity, inheritance, lineage, and legitimacy. The genealogy was more than just a family tree. It was the proof that every person's story belonged within a larger story. And to lose your genealogy was to lose a piece of your identity. I also believe all of those names were recorded so that we, as future Christians, pray over the bloodlines of those genealogies for protection. The early chapters of Genesis reveal a world where memory and history remained closely connected to living witnesses. Adam lived for centuries, according to the biblical count, like 900 years, somewhere on there, and his descendants overlapped one another across generations. The distance between creation and later patriarchs was far more smaller than many people imagine when reading the text. Stories did not travel through hundreds of disconnected storytellers. They often passed through a relatively small chain of individuals who preserved and repeated what they had received. Now, this was one reason ancient cultures placed such importance on oral tradition. Modern societies often assume written records are automatically superior, but oral cultures developed sophisticated methods for preserving information. Repetition, structure, poetry, and communal recitation helped ensure that important accounts remained intact. Entire communities participated in preserving memory. A story remembered by one person could be distorted. A story remembered by an entire people became far difficult to alter. So Scripture repeatedly presents memory as a sacred responsibility rather than a passive activity. God did not simply reveal truth and assume people would remember it. He commanded them to remember again and again. God's people were instructed to teach their children, recite his works, discuss his commandments, and preserve the testimony of what he had done. Now, memory required effort. Forgetfulness was not viewed as a minor inconvenience. It was often portrayed as a spiritual danger. And this connection between memory and faith appears throughout the biblical narrative. When Israel forgot God's works, and it didn't take long, and they did it many times, they drifted into idolatry. When they remembered his deliverance, they returned back to obedience. The struggle was rarely about whether God had acted. The struggle was whether people could continue to remember what he had already done. The battle for memory became a battle for identity, and the battle for identity became a battle for faithfulness. Now, ancient memorials served this purpose as well. Stones were erected after significant events. Altars marked encounters with God. Physical objects became anchors for collective memory. Future generations would see those markers and ask questions. The stories attached to those markers would then be retold. Well, in this way, memory was preserved not merely through information, but through participation. Each generation became a witness to events that they never had personally experienced. What's fascinating is that some or the same principle remains true today, believe it or not. Every family possesses its own registry of memory through photographs, journals, heirlooms, letters, and stories that all serve the same purpose that genealogies and memorial stones once served. They remind us who we are and where we came from. And when these records disappear, something deeper than information is lost. A connection to identity begins to fade. The first registry of memory was never a government archive or a royal library. It was the witness carried by ordinary people who understood that truth survives only when someone chooses to remember it. And as humanity multiplied after the flood, a new pattern began to emerge. People gathered together not merely for survival, but for a common purpose. The account of Babel describes a civilization united by a single language and a shared ambition. They settled in one place, developed common goals, and began constructing a tower that would symbolize their achievement. While much attention is given to the tower itself, the deeper issue may have been the concentration of humanity into a single system. For the first time since the flood, people were attempting to centralize not only their location, but their identity, authority, and future. A unified language created something very powerful. Information could move without barriers. Ideas could spread rapidly. Knowledge could be shared across the entire population. And in many ways, this represented a remarkable achievement. Communication allowed cooperation, and cooperation allowed progress. Yet Scripture presents Babel as a turning point that required divine intervention. The concern was not bricks and mortar. It was what humanity intended to do with its growing unity and power. When people centralize authority, they naturally begin centralizing records as well. Decisions, laws, traditions, and histories become concentrated within the institutions that govern society. The same process can be observed throughout all of history. Large kingdoms create archives. Empires establish official histories. Governments preserve records that support administration and control. Centralization often increases efficiency, but it also creates a vulnerability. When memory is stored in one place, whoever controls that place gains influence over the narrative. Well, the story of Babel raises an interesting question. What happens when a single system becomes the primary source of truth for an entire civilization? Diversity of memory begins to disappear. Independent witness becomes less important. Local traditions become secondary to centralized authority. The more concentrated the system becomes, the easier it is for a small group to influence what everyone else accepts as real. Whether intentional or not, centralization tends to reduce competing versions of history and elevate official versions of history. Well, this pattern repeatedly repeats itself throughout the ancient world. Great cities became centers of learning, commerce, religion, and government. Their archives grew. Their records expanded. Their influence spread. Yet whenever a city fell, vast amounts of information often disappeared with it. The concentration of knowledge brought power, but it also created fragility. A fire, invasion, or political upheaval could erase generations of accumulated memory in a matter of days. And I don't know if you guys know this, but the Alexandria Library burned down not once, not twice, but 3 times. The Scripture's account of Babel can therefore be viewed as more than a story about language. It is also a story about concentration. Humanity sought unity apart from God's direction and attempted to establish its own vision for the future. The result was a system so centralized that God intervened by confusing their language and scattering the population. Now, whether one interprets the event literally, symbolically, or even both, the outcome is pretty significant. Power was dispersed, authority was fragmented. No single human institution retained complete control over the whole. Well, the scattering of nations produced challenges, but it also created a form of protection. Different peoples preserved different histories, traditions, and records. No single empire could easily dominate every culture simultaneously. Multiple witnesses emerged across the world, and this diversity of memory complicated the ambitions of rulers who desired universal control. It became much harder to rewrite the entire story when many communities preserved their own versions of events. Let me give an example. The Civil War. Everyone thinks it was fought over slavery. It was not. The Civil War was fought over the South wanting their own central bank to compete against the North's central bank. As we look at the modern world, the themes of Babel feel surprisingly familiar. Technology has once again connected humanity through a common framework. Information travels globally within seconds. Vast amounts of knowledge are stored in centralized databases, cloud systems, and digital platforms. The ability to communicate has reached levels previous generations could scarcely even imagine. Yet the same questions remain. Who controls the records? Who determines what is preserved? Who decides what is visible and what is forgotten? Well, the lesson of Babel may not be that unity is inherently wrong. Cooperation has produced extraordinary achievements throughout human history. The lesson may instead be a warning about concentrating too much authority, too much memory, and too much influence within a single system. Whenever knowledge becomes centralized, the temptation to manage memory follows closely behind. And whenever memory becomes concentrated in the hands of a few, the possibility of rewriting the story grows larger than most people even realize. Now, as civilizations grew larger and more sophisticated, memory began moving from families and oral traditions into permanent repositories. Clay tablets, scrolls, inscriptions, and manuscripts allowed information to survive beyond the lifespan of those who created it. The rise of libraries represented one of humanity's greatest achievements. And for the first time, knowledge could be gathered, organized, and preserved on a scale never before possible. Yet those repositories of memory quickly became valuable targets for those seeking power. Ancient kings understood something that remains even true today. Controlling the present often requires controlling the story of the past. A ruler who could shape history could strengthen his legitimacy, justify his policies, and influence future generations. Victorious dynasties frequently commissioned official histories that portrayed their reigns favorably while minimizing the achievements of their rivals. Records became tools not only of preservation, but also of persuasion. History was remembered, but it was often remembered through the lens of those who held authority. One of the most common practices in the ancient world was the destruction of a predecessor's legacy. Monuments were defaced. Names were removed from inscriptions. Statues were destroyed. Entire reigns were sometimes erased from official records. Now, the goal was not merely revenge, it was memory removal. Because if future generations never encountered the evidence, they would eventually forget the person altogether. And the dead could no longer defend themselves. And the historical record became whatever the surviving rulers declared it to be. Now, this pattern appeared across numerous civilizations. Egyptian pharaohs occasionally removed references to rivals. Assyrian kings celebrated victories while minimizing defeats. Roman leaders commissioned histories that supported the stability of the empire. And in many cases, guys, historians worked with the records available to them, unaware that previous records had already been altered, destroyed, or selectively preserved. The result was a chain of memory shaped by generations of political interests. And libraries themselves became symbols of power because they represented control over accumulated knowledge. Now, the larger the archive, the greater the influence of the institution that maintained it. And with today's database centers, the same rule applies. Rulers funded collections not only because they valued learning, but because knowledge enhanced prestige and authority. To possess the records of a civilization was to possess part of its identity. Archives became treasures as valuable as gold because they contained the memory of entire peoples. The tragedy is that many of these repositories proved remarkably vulnerable. Wars, invasions, fires, and natural disasters repeatedly destroyed vast collections of records. A single military campaign could erase centuries of accumulated knowledge. Entire works known to have existed are now available only through references found in surviving texts. Historians often know a book once existed because another author quoted it, yet the original manuscript itself has vanished. Humanity's memory is filled with such gaps, even the Bible. And sometimes destruction occurred intentionally. Conquerors occasionally targeted records because they understood their significance. Eliminating archives weakened cultural identity and disrupted continuity between generations. If a people lost access to their history, they became easier to assimilate into a new political order. Destroying memory often proved more effective than destroying buildings because memory is what allows a civilization to rebuild itself after hardship. And at other times, records disappeared through simple neglect, like NASA losing all the data on how to get to the moon. Oopsie. Languages changed. Manuscripts deteriorated. Copying became expensive. Texts considered unimportant by one generation failed to survive into the next. Not every loss resulted from conspiracy or deliberate suppression. Many losses occurred because preservation requires constant effort. A document that is not copied eventually fades. A story that is not retold eventually disappears. Memory survives not only when people actively choose to protect it, but when they choose to want it. And this reality should remind us how fragile history truly is. Now, modern readers often assume the historical record is complete because so much information is available. They're naive enough to think that when an author puts a book out, they're not lying. There's no wisdom in that. Because in truth, what survives? Well, let's take a step back. Modern readers often assume the historical record is complete because so much information is available. But in truth, what survives is only a fraction of what once existed. Countless of books, letters, chronicles, and testimonies have vanished forever. What we call history is often the collection of records that endured while countless of others were lost. And the challenge for historians is not merely understanding what remains, it is recognizing how much has already disappeared. And the lesson from libraries, kings, and conquerors, well, it's pretty straightforward. Memory has always been valuable because memory shapes identity. Those who sought power understood this long before the modern age. Some preserved records, others destroyed them, like NASA. Some expanded humanity's understanding of the past. Others narrowed it. Yet beneath every archive, every monument, and every historical record lies the same enduring truth. Whoever influences memory gains influence over the future. Now, one of the most fascinating questions in both religious and historical study is not which books survived, but which books did not. Throughout the Bible, readers occasionally encounter references to writings that are no longer part of most modern collections of Scripture. These references often appear briefly and without explanation, leaving many people wondering what happened to these works and why they disappeared from common use. Their existence reminds us that the biblical record and the biblical world contained far more written material than what ultimately became part of any single canon. Like the book of Jasher, which is perhaps one of the best known examples. It is mentioned in both Joshua and Samuel, where readers are directed to it as a source connecting to historical events. Then there's the book of the Wars of the Lord, referenced in the book of Numbers. Other writings, such as the Acts of Solomon, or the book of Nathan, the prophet, or the book of Gad, the seer, or the visions of Edo, they're all mentioned in the historical books. And these references indicate that ancient Israel maintained records, histories, prophetic writings, and chronicles far beyond those preserved in the biblical canon itself. Now, for many people, the discovery of these references creates an uncomfortable question. If these books were important enough to be mentioned, why are they not available today? Well, the answer is not always clear. In some cases, the works may have been lost through the ordinary process of history. Manuscripts decay, they do. Wars destroy archives. Boom, boom, pew, pew. Languages do disappear. Libraries do burn down. Well, the ancient world possessed no printing presses, no cloud storage, and no digital backups. A text survived only if generations after generations considered it valuable enough to copy by hand. And at the same time, not every surviving ancient book was treated equally. Communities made decisions regarding which writings would be copied, taught, read publicly, and preserved with the greatest care. Over centuries, collections of sacred writings emerged within different traditions. Judaism, various Christian communities, and later church authorities, they all played roles in determining which texts would occupy central positions in worship and doctrine. Well, these decisions were often influenced by questions of authorship, consistency, theological value, and widespread acceptance among believers. Well, this is where the subject becomes particularly interesting. Different faith traditions preserved different collections of sacred literature. What one community viewed as essential, another community might consider secondary. Some books remained widely circulated in one religion while becoming rare in another. And the result is that various biblical canons developed across the Christian world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition, for example, preserved texts such as 1st Enoch and Jubilees long after they disappeared from most Western canons. Their survival demonstrates that the history of preservation is often more complicated than many people actually assume. The existence of these differences reveals an important truth about memory. Preservation is rarely neutral. Every generation becomes a steward of the records it inherits. Decisions must be made about what to copy, what to teach, what to translate, and what to prioritize. Most of these decisions are made with sincere intentions, yet they inevitably shape what future generations will know. And the books that survive continue speaking. The books that disappear, they gradually fall silent. Now, this does not automatically mean that every lost text contained hidden truths or suppressed revelations. Some works may have been ordinary historical records. Others may have been superseded by later writings. Some may simply have failed to gain widespread circulation. Well, the temptation is to assume that every missing book contains explosive information deliberately concealed from humanity. Some are. Some are just lost. But we don't have enough data to really put a number on it. The percentages. The temptation is to assume that every missing book contains explosive information that's deliberately concealed from you. And history rarely supports such simple conclusions, unfortunately. Nevertheless, the existence of lost books reminds us that the historical record is incomplete and that our understanding of the ancient world is based upon what has survived rather than everything that once existed. And what makes the subject especially relevant today is that we continue discovering ancient texts and manuscripts. Thank God. 1947, I think, was a blessing when that boy was throwing stones into a cave and hit a pot, a jar, and found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Archaeological finds occasionally recover writings that were taught or thought to be lost forever. Fragments emerge from caves, monasteries, deserts, and forgotten collections. Each discovery provides another glimpse into the intellectual and spiritual world of earlier generations. Sometimes these discoveries confirm what was already actually known. Sometimes they challenge assumptions and raise new questions. Well, in every case, they remind us that history remains larger than the surviving record. And the deeper lesson is not merely about missing books here. It is about the fragile nature of memory itself. Entire works can disappear despite being known, valued, and referenced by the people who once possessed them. Well, if this could happen in the ancient world, it should humble modern readers who assume today's information will automatically survive tomorrow. Well, preservation requires effort, guys. Memory requires stewardship. What is not protected can be lost. And when we examine the books that vanished, we are confronted with a reality that extends far beyond theology. Human knowledge is always incomplete. Every generation inherits only part of the story. Some records endure, sure. Others fade. Some voices remain audible across centuries. Others are reduced to brief references and unanswered questions. Well, the registry of memory contains both what survived and the shadows of what was lost. And sometimes those shadows tell us just as much about history as the records that remain. Now, few places capture humanity's imagination quite like the Library of Alexandria. And for centuries, it has stood as a symbol of lost knowledge. People hear its name and immediately imagine vast halls filled with scrolls, scholars from distant lands, and secrets that vanished into the ashes of history. Well, whether every story told about Alexandria is accurate is almost beside the point. The library has become a reminder of a reality that many people struggle to accept. Humanity does not possess a complete record of its own past. How shameful. Founded in ancient Egypt under the Greek rulers who followed Alexander the Great, Alexandria became one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Scholars gathered there to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, literature, and history. Records from numerous cultures were collected and copied. The ambition was extraordinary. Those who managed the library sought to gather the knowledge of the known world into a single repository. And it was, in many ways, one of humanity's earliest attempts to create a universal archive. And the vision itself was remarkable. Ships arriving in the harbor were reportedly searching for books and scrolls. Copies were made and preserved. Scholars compared manuscripts, translated texts, and organized information. So knowledge from Egypt, Greece, Persia, and other regions all flowed into a central collection. Thus, the library became more than just a building. It became a symbol of civilization's belief that knowledge could be gathered, preserved, and protected from the passage of time. Yet history teaches us a painful lesson. No archive is permanent, even in digital data. No repository is invulnerable. No collection of records is guaranteed survival. The exact circumstances surrounding the decline and destruction of the Library of Alexandria, well, they remain debated among historians, believe it or not. And rather than a single catastrophic event, evidence suggests a series of losses occurred across centuries through wars. Regardless of the details, the result was the same. A vast collection of knowledge had just simply disappeared, which is, as the dude would put it, a bummer, dude. Well, what was lost? Well, the honest answer is that nobody knows. That uncertainty is precisely what makes Alexandria so powerful as a symbol. Historians can identify certain works that vanished. References survive to books that are no longer available. And ancient authors mentioned sources that they consulted that are no longer even exist anymore. Yet beyond those fragments lies a much larger mystery. Entire categories of knowledge may have been lost without leaving any trace that they ever existed at all. Humanity cannot catalog what it does not know is missing. Well, this reality challenges a common assumption of the modern world today. Many people believe that history is largely complete. Hardly. They assume that enough records survive to provide an accurate understanding of the past. No. And they don't even teach that in college or our university, maybe some. While historians have accomplished remarkable work reconstructing ancient civilizations, the truth is far more complicated, as it always is. The surviving record is often a tiny fraction of what once existed. And for every manuscript preserved, countless others then disappeared. And for every inscription discovered, thousands may have been destroyed. So the historical picture here we possess, well, it's valuable, but it's not complete. And the story of Alexandria also reveals a paradox. The larger a repository becomes, the more valuable it becomes, but also the more devastating its loss becomes. And when knowledge is concentrated into one place, that place becomes a treasure and an enemy to those who want power. It also becomes a target, and a decentralized collection spreads across many communities may be harder to assemble, but it is often more difficult to erase entirely. Well, this lesson appears repeatedly throughout all of history, folks. Concentrated memory creates efficiency. Distributed memory creates resilience. Well, the digital age has revived this ancient tension in new forms today. Humanity today possesses archives far larger than anything the scholars of Alexandria could have ever imagined or dreamed. Entire libraries can fit onto devices small enough to fit into your pocket. Cloud storage systems contain more information than ancient civilizations accumulated all across the centuries. Yet much of this information exists within highly centralized infrastructures. Data centers, digital repositories, and networked systems, they all now function as modern libraries. Well, the scale is unprecedented, but the underlying question remains unchanged. What happens if those repositories fail, or are altered, or even, well, disappear? And perhaps the greatest misconception surrounding Alexandria is the belief that If the library had survived, humanity would possess complete knowledge of the ancient world. Complete knowledge has never existed, folks. And even the greatest archive is even selective. Every collection reflects choices about what to preserve. Every librarian, scribe, historian, and archivist inherits limitations. Well, Alexandria was extraordinary, yes, but it was never complete. Well, no archive is. No institution can preserve everything. And the true lesson here of Alexandria is therefore not simply that knowledge can be lost. It is that memory is always fragile. The records that we inherit are precious, precisely because they survived against enormous odds. The past reaches us through fragments, witnesses, manuscripts, monuments, and traditions that endured while countless others disappeared. And when we imagine the halls of Alexandria, we are not merely mourning lost books. We are confronting the uncomfortable truth that every generation sees history through an incomplete window. Well, that realization should produce humility. It should remind us that there are things that we know and things that we think we know, and there are countless things that we may never know. The Registry of Memory is not a perfect record. It is a surviving record, as Alexandria stands as a monument to both humanity's desire to preserve knowledge and humanity's inability to guarantee its own survival. Well, in that sense, the library remains one of history's greatest warnings. What it remembered today can be forgotten tomorrow. And what is forgotten tomorrow may never be recovered ever again. And that's when empires rewrite the story. Because if the Library of Alexandria teaches us that memory can be lost, the history of empires teaches us that memory can be reshaped. Throughout history, powerful governments have rarely been content to simply rule the present. They have often sought to define the past as well. And the reason is simple. People draw legitimacy from history. Nations justify policies through history. Leaders claim authority through history. So whoever controls the story of yesterday gains influence over the decisions of today. Well, this pattern can be observed all across nearly every major civilization known to man. And when a new dynasty came to power, it often commissioned official histories explaining why its rule was necessary. Well, previous rulers were portrayed as corrupt, incomplete, or illegitimate. Victories were celebrated. Failures were minimized. Historical narratives became tools for strengthening the authority of the current regime. Well, the goal was not always deception. Sometimes rulers genuinely believed their versions of the event. Yet the result was often the same, as history became filtered through the priorities of those in power. Dicks. Well, the Roman Empire provides a powerful example here. Rome produced extraordinary records, histories, legal documents, and public monuments. And much of what we know about the ancient world survives because Roman writers preserved it. Yet, Roman historians were also products of their own environment. They wrote from within the empire. They interpreted events through Roman perspectives. Well, enemies of Rome often appear in the historical record through Roman descriptions rather than their own voices. Future generations inherited an enormous amount of information, but much of it arrived through the lens of imperial power. Well, this phenomenon extends far beyond Rome. Every empire tends to create official narratives that support its identity. School systems teach foundational stories, public monuments reinforce collective memory, national holidays commemorate particular events while ignoring others. Historical anniversaries are selected because they strengthen a desired understanding of the nation's past. Well, these practices are not inherently malicious. Every society actually preserves certain memories more actively than others. But the challenge arises when preservation becomes selective enough to distort reality. And one of the most effective ways to rewrite history is not by creating false information, but by controlling the emphasis. Certain events receive constant attention while others receive little attention at all. Certain figures become heroes while others fade into obscurity. Entire chapters of history can remain technically available, yet practically invisible because few people encounter them. Silence often shapes memory as effectively as censorship. And people cannot remember what they were never taught. And religious history demonstrates that same principle. Different traditions preserved different interpretations of events, councils, doctrines, and texts. Communities emphasized records that supported their understanding of the faith while giving less attention to competing perspectives. But again, this does not necessarily imply bad motives. Human beings naturally preserve what they consider important. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect is that future generations inherit a history shaped by countless decisions, regardless of what deserved preservation and what did not. Well, the modern era has introduced a new mechanism for shaping historical narratives. Mass media, publishing industries, educational institutions, and digital platforms. Well, they all participate in determining which stories receive attention. Well, unlike ancient kings who commissioned official chronicles, modern societies often rely upon vast networks of institutions that collectively influence public memory. And the process may be decentralized in some ways, but the outcome remains familiar. Certain narratives become dominant while others remain on the margins. And this reality can create understandable suspicion. People begin noticing gaps, inconsistencies, and forgotten stories. They discover events that received little attention despite their significance. They encounter historical figures who seem absent from mainstream discussions. And sometimes these discoveries reveal genuine oversights. Other times, they actually inspire speculative theories that go beyond the available evidence. But the challenge is learning to recognize the difference, through discernment and prayer. A missing emphasis does not automatically prove a deliberate cover-up, but it does remind us that history is never presented in a perfectly neutral way. And what's important to understand is that rewriting history rarely begins with fabricating the entire past. It usually begins with small adjustments. Detail here is omitted, detail omitted here and there. And an event, it's reframed. A figure may be elevated, another diminished. But over time, those changes accumulate. Generations later, the resulting narrative may look significantly different from the original events. Thus, no single alteration appears dramatic, yet the overall picture gradually shifts. And as we've learned on this show, the reason why the Apocrypha was not included anymore in the King James Bible was because of a Protestant printing press making a decision to remove it because it's cheaper to make it and sell it. And this is why independent records matter so much, guys. Personal journals, local archives, family histories, letters, church records, and community traditions, they all often preserve perspectives that larger institutions always overlook. Multiple witnesses create resilience within the historical record, and when numerous sources survive, it becomes harder for any single narrative to dominate completely. And the preservation of diverse testimony acts as a safeguard against the tendency of power to simplify or reshape the past. And the lesson from history of empires is not that every official account is false. Many official records contain tremendous value and historical insight. The lesson is that power has always possessed an interest in memory. And whether ancient kings carving inscriptions into stone or modern institutions curating digital archives, the relationship between authority and history remains remarkably consistent. Every empire tells a story about itself. The responsibility of the future generations is to examine those stories carefully, compare witnesses, and remember that the registry of memory is always larger than any single version of events. Kind of like seeing all these UFOs and aliens now that you're seeing on social media. Oh my God, here's an alien. Oh, here's an alien that Russia videotaped in the 1950s. It's all bullshit, guys. Well, if all social media is bullshit, should we not assume that all records that were kept were bullshit? You think that, during these modern times that rulers just appeared to be angry and horrible. But if you read 1st and 2nd Kings, even Israel had horrible kings who did horrible things. And yet we just don't remember it that way. Now, for most of human history, memory was limited by physical space. Records had to be carved into stone, written on parchment, copied onto scrolls, or even printed into books. Preservation required labor, materials, and time. A library containing thousands of volumes was considered an extraordinary achievement. Yet today, that entire library could fit on a small device, enough to slip into your pocket. And humanity has entered an age where information is no longer constrained by shelves, buildings, or geography. We have created the largest registry of memory the world has ever known, that we know of anyway. And at first glance, this appears to be the solution to one of history's greatest problems. If ancient civilizations lost knowledge because records were destroyed, well, digital technology seems to offer a way around that limitation. Documents can be copied instantly, archives can be duplicated across continents, libraries can exist simultaneously in multiple locations. Information that once required years of travel can now be accessed within seconds. So never before has so much knowledge been available to so many people. And thanks to AI, 3 years ago, we got access to it even faster. Yet every technological solution introduces new vulnerabilities. The digital registry is vast, yes, but it also is dependent upon systems that previous generations never had to consider. Well, electricity must flow, servers must function, networks must remain connected, data formats must remain readable. And why would you create World War III now while you're building a bunch of data centers? Makes no sense. Unlike a stone inscription buried beneath the earth, digital records often require an entire infrastructure to remain accessible. The information may exist, true, but without the supporting system, it can become effectively invisible. Another challenge emerges from the sheer volume of information. Ancient people struggled because they lacked records. Modern people often struggle because they have too many. Every day, humanity produces staggering amounts of data. Articles, videos, photographs, messages, databases, and digital documents accumulate at a pace no individual can fully absorb. And the problem is no longer just storage. The problem now is navigation. Finding trustworthy information within an ocean of content has become one of the defining challenges of the modern age. And this is where the gatekeepers of the digital registry become so important. In the ancient world, a person visiting a library and search through archives of shelves, but today, most people rely on algorithms. Search engines determine what appears first. Social media platforms determine what gains visibility. Recommendation systems decide what information receives attention and which information remains buried. Well, these tools provide tremendous convenience, sure, but they also shape what people encounter. And for many users, if information cannot be found easily, it effectively does not exist. And unlike the kings and emperors of the past, modern gatekeepers often do not need to destroy records to influence the memory here. Information can remain technically available while becoming practically invisible. A document may still exist somewhere within a database, yet few people will ever see it. And the issue shifts from preservation to discoverability. In previous centuries, control was often exercised through physical access, and today influence is frequently exercised through visibility and prioritization. Well, this creates a subtle but significant transformation in how memory functions. You see, historically, a book either survived or it did not. A scroll either existed or it had been lost. The digital age introduced a middle category, as information can survive while remaining effectively hidden. Vast archives can contain valuable records, yet only a small percentage of users ever encounter them. The result is that memory increasingly depends not only on preservation, but on the systems that organize and present information. So the concentration of digital infrastructure raises additional questions here. A significant portion of humanity's knowledge now resides within a relatively small number of technological ecosystems. Data centers, cloud providers, search platforms, and digital repositories, they all function as modern libraries on a global scale. Their importance cannot be overstated. If the ancient world viewed great libraries as treasures, then today's digital archives represents repositories of memory beyond anything previous civilizations could imagine. Yet centralization begins familiar concerns. The larger the repository, the more significant its influence over collective memory becomes. And there's also the issue of permanence. Many people assume that digital information lasts forever, but in reality, digital records can be surprisingly fragile. Websites disappear, databases become obsolete, Companies shut down. Storage media degrades. Entire communities have vanished from the internet with little trace remaining. And historians of the future may face challenges that very different from those of the past. Because instead of searching for missing scrolls, they may be searching for corrupt files, inaccessible formats, or archives that were never properly preserved. And perhaps the greatest irony here of the digital registry is that humanity now possesses the ability to preserve more information than ever before, while simultaneously facing unprecedented uncertainty about its long-term survival. You see, all these data centers are putting in right now today, they need to be paid for. And all those servers that are going to be running here within the next year or two in those data centers, they're going to need to be replaced. They become obsolete within the first year that they're used. And a typical server will last 10 years and it must be replaced. You see, we have multiplied memory beyond anything the ancient world could even imagine, yet we've also concentrated it within systems that few people rarely even fully understand. So the registry has grown larger, yes, but its guardians have become increasingly invisible. And as we move deeper into the digital age, the question is no longer whether humanity can preserve information. Oh no, we can. The question is who controls access to that information, who determines its visibility, and how future generations will distinguish authentic records from manipulated ones. Well, the digital registry may be the greatest archive ever created, but like every archive before it, it remains vulnerable to the timeless struggle between preservation, power, and memory. So if the internet became humanity's largest archive, artificial intelligence may become humanity's largest interpreter of that archive. This represents a profound shift in the history of memory here. For thousands of years, people searched through records themselves. They visited libraries, read books, compared sources, and formed conclusions. Well, today, an increasing number of people are beginning to ask machines to summarize, organize, and explain information on their behalf. Well, the registry of memory is no longer merely being stored. It's being filtered through artificial intelligence. This development carries enormous promise, as AI can process information at a scale impossible for any individual human being to do by themselves. It can identify patterns across vast collections of documents. It can translate languages, summarize research, and make knowledge more accessible to people who would otherwise struggle to find it. And in many ways, artificial intelligence functions like an assistant librarian capable of navigating an archive so large that no human could ever fully explore it all alone and on its own. Yet every interpreter influences understanding. A historian selects which sources to emphasize, while a teacher chooses which details to explain. A journalist decides which facts to include in a story. Well, artificial intelligence introduces a whole brand new layer between humanity and its records. As the machine does not create the archive, it increasingly helps determine how people experience the archive. And for many users, the answer generated by an AI may become more important than the original source itself. Well, this raises an important question. What happens when most people stop interacting directly with records and only begin relying primarily on interpretations? AI, show me the source. Source not found. Then how can you prove this exists? The issue is not unique here to artificial intelligence. Human beings have always depended on experts, teachers, and translators because we're lazy. The difference is scale here, as AI can influence millions of people simultaneously. A single system can become a primary gateway to information for entire populations. The interpreter begins to shape the relationship between the public and the registry of memory, and I believe AI is doing tests on the American people themselves to find out if they would be stupid enough to fall for, hey, I want to play pickleball, which happens to be the fastest growing sport ever. It's everywhere, and I think that is an AI test to see how many people will fall for it. How many people will jump into something that, well, they normally would have never done, but yet it's now seems to be more popular than tennis itself. Another challenge emerged from the way that artificial intelligence learns. AI systems are trained on large collections of existing data, and they inherit the strength and weaknesses of those collections. If information is missing from that archive, the AI may never encounter it. If certain perspectives dominate the available records, well, those perspectives may receive greater representation in the system's responses. And the machine reflects the data that it receives. Well, in this sense, artificial intelligence does not escape the historical problem of memory. It inherits them. And the concept of synthetic memory introduces an even more significant concern, as for most of human history, records represented actual events, actual witnesses, and actual documents. Well, today, machines can generate convincing texts, images, audio, and video. A person may soon encounter a photograph that never existed, hear a voice that never even spoke, or read a document that was never written by a human author. Well, the distinction between preserved memory and manufactured memory becomes increasingly difficult to recognize, and this is absolutely important today when you are searching for the truth. Now, it doesn't mean that every AI-generated piece of content is deceptive, and many applications are useful and beneficial, but the concern is much, much more broader. Human civilization has traditionally relied upon evidence, testimony, and records to establish truth. Well, who's controlling all of those records? Who's holding the data? If synthetic content becomes indistinguishable from authentic content, then future generations may face a crisis unlike ever before. The challenge will no longer be recovering lost information. The challenge will be determining which information reflects reality and which information was created after the fact. We're going to need tools to identify what's AI and what is not. And guess who's going to create those tools? Mostly those who are rich and in power. And ironically, the more advanced our tools become, the more valuable old principles may become as historians verify sources. Journalists seek cooperation, and courts require witnesses. Well, Scripture emphasizes testimony established by multiple witnesses as these practices develop, because human beings have always needed methods of and for separating truth from error. Artificial intelligence does not eliminate that need. If anything, it actually increases it. And the greater the volume of information, the more important verification actually becomes. And there's also a deeper philosophical question hiding beneath the technology here. Memory has traditionally been tied to human experience, while people remembered events because they lived through them. Families preserve stories because those stories belonged to them, and communities maintain traditions because those traditions shaped their identity. Well, artificial intelligence can store and process information, but it does not experience life as human beings do. It can organize memory, yet it does not possess memory in the same way a witness possesses memory. And that distinction may become increasingly important as society grows more dependent on machine-generated knowledge. Now, for some people, some people actually fear artificial intelligence because they believe it will replace human judgment. That's a big concern. Others celebrate it because they believe it will solve humanity's information problems. Well, the reality is likely even more complicated. AI is a tool, and like every powerful tool, its impact depends on how it's used. It can preserve knowledge, expand access, and uncover connections hidden within massive archives. It can also amplify errors, reinforce blind spots, and create convincing illusions if carelessly is being used. Well, the Registry of Memory is entering a whole brand new chapter as ancient civilizations who relied on storytellers in the past. Now, later generations rely on scribes and libraries and printed books. Well, the modern world built digital archives. Now, artificial intelligence stands between humanity and an ever-expanding ocean of information. And whether this development becomes one of civilization's greatest achievements or one of its own greatest challenges may depend upon a simple question. Will people continue to value truth more than convenience? Because no matter how advanced the tools become, memory remains only as trustworthy as the witness and records upon which it is built. Now, if memory is the registry of civilization, testimony is the mechanism that keeps that registry alive. Long before there were archives, databases, and libraries, there were witnesses. Someone saw an event. Someone experienced a moment. Someone preserved the account and passed it on to other generations. Well, every historical record, every family story, every sacred text, and every legal document ultimately traces back to testimony. And without witnesses, memory fades into speculation. And with witnesses, memory gains substance and continuity. Well, this principle appears throughout all of Scripture. The Bible repeatedly emphasizes witnesses because God understands something about human nature. You see, people forget, stories change, time erodes details. And for that reason, important matters were often established through multiple witnesses. A single claim could be questioned, and multiple witnesses created confirmation. The principle was not merely legal, it was a safeguard for memory itself. And truth became stronger when it was preserved by more than one voice. Now, the importance of testimony can be seen throughout all of Israel's history. Parents were instructed to teach their children. Elders recounted God's works to younger generations, and festivals were observed so that future descendants would remember events that they never personally even witnessed. The Passover meal, for example, functioned as more than a religious observance. It was a living act of remembrance. As each generation entered the story through testimony, memory survived because people continued telling the story. And believe me, after 100 years, another generation comes, and then 100 years ago, that generation told the story. They witnessed and saw the Red Sea part. Well, the generations ahead of them, they won't believe it. The New Testament follows the same pattern. The Gospels are testimonies. The apostles repeatedly describe themselves as witnesses. They spoke about what they had seen, heard, and experienced. Well, Christianity spread not through abstract philosophy alone, but through testimony. Individuals carried accounts from one community to another, and churches preserved letters. Believers copied manuscripts. The faith expanded because witnesses preserved memory and entrusted it to others. And what makes a testimony so powerful is that it exists outside centralized systems. Now, an empire may control official records, but governments may influence institutions. Libraries may be destroyed, yet testimony can survive through ordinary people. Family histories often preserve details that never appear in national archives, and local communities, they remember events that historians often overlook. Personal journals, letters, photographs, and oral traditions, they frequently contain perspectives absent from official accounts. Well, the Registry of Memory is not maintained only by institutions, it's maintained by countless individuals who choose to remember. Do you choose? Because as we move toward a culture and future increasingly shaped by algorithms, artificial intelligence, and digital archives, testimony may become more important rather than less. Because the world will possess no shortage of information. What it may desperately need are trustworthy witnesses. Technology can store records, great, but it cannot replace the responsibility of individuals to preserve the truth. And the battle for testimony is therefore not merely a battle over information, it's a battle over trust, credibility, and the willingness of ordinary people to bear witness of what they know. For most of human history, the greatest threat to memory was loss. Records were destroyed by war, libraries burned, manuscripts decayed, stories faded, generations passed away, and humanity spent thousands of years struggling against forgetfulness. Today, however, we may be approaching a very different problem. The challenge of the future may not be that there is too little information. The challenge may be that there's too much information and not enough certainty. For the first time in human history, humanity is creating a world where nearly everything can be recorded. Conversations, photographs, financial transactions, communications, locations, and personal histories all can be stored digitally. Future generations may inherit more data about our era than exists for all previous centuries, all combined. At first glance, this appears to be a triumph for preservation, but nothing will be forgotten because everything will be recorded, right? Yet quantity and reliability are not the same thing. The value of a record depends upon trust. Artificial intelligence now allows the creation of realistic images, videos, voices, and documents that never existed in the physical world. Well, as these technologies improve, the average person may struggle to distinguish authentic records from synthetic ones. If they struggle to tell the difference between fake AI, how can a jury or a court or a judge, when you're being represented and a fake video is being presented, it wasn't me. It was the one-armed man. Well, this, in what many observers are now calling a crisis of verification. In previous generations, historians often struggled because evidence was scarce. Future historians may struggle because evidence is abundant, but authentically, it's difficult to establish. And the danger extends beyond the deliberate deception itself, as information increasingly personalizes what people see. Two individuals searching for the same subject may receive different results. News feeds, recommendation engines, and algorithms, they all tailor content based on behavior and preferences. Well, over time, people may inhabit increasingly different informational environments despite living in the same society. Well, collective memory begins to fragment. Shared understanding becomes harder to maintain because individuals are no longer drawing from the same pool of information. And ironically, the future may cause society to rediscover the value of older forms of preservation. Physical books, printed records, family archives, handwritten journals, and local histories all possess qualities that the digital systems sometimes lack. They're difficult to alter remotely, and they provide tangible chains of custody, and they preserve evidence in forms that can survive technological transitions. Well, once appeared outdated, may be increasingly valuable as confidence in digital authenticity declines. In fact, one could argue that carving in stone will preserve history longer than your memory card. You see, memory shapes identity. If people become uncertain about what is true, regardless of history, well, they become uncertain about who they are. And this is why the battle for memory matters so much. It's not simply about preserving facts. It's about preserving continuity between generations. And as we come to the end of this discussion, it becomes clear that the story of memory is really the story of humanity itself. Every civilization leaves behind traces of its own existence. Some leave monuments, some leave books, some leave laws, songs, letters, and records. But together, these fragments form the registry of memory that connects one generation to the next. And without that registry, the past becomes unreachable, and the lessons purchased by those who came before us begin to disappear. Well, I follow this pattern. From the earliest genealogies of Genesis to the digital archives of the modern world, it wasn't hard because I used AI as well. And we have seen how families preserved memory before libraries even existed. And I examined Babel and the dangers of centralized systems. I looked at kings who rewrote history, conquerors who destroyed records, lost books that vanished from circulation, and great libraries whose treasures disappeared into the fog of time. The tools have changed throughout the centuries, but the struggle has remained remarkably consistent as memory is valuable because memory shapes identity. Scripture repeatedly calls God's people to remember because remembrance is an act of faithfulness. Israel was commanded to remember the covenant. 10 commands. Parents were instructed to teach their children. Memorial stones were raised so future generations would ask questions about events that they never witnessed. So the biblical pattern is very clear. Truth survives when people deliberately preserve it. Forgetfulness is rarely accidental. It's often the result of neglect. And this is perhaps the greatest lesson of all. The registry of memory is not ultimately stored in buildings, databases, or servers, folks. Those things are important, but they're not enough. Memory survives because people choose to remember. Memory survives because witnesses refuse to remain silent. It survives because truth matters more than convenience. Every generation receives a portion of the story, and every generation must decide whether it will preserve that story for those who come after. Now you understand why the importance of not lying is actually key to our survival. And the question that we began in the beginning of this, it remains worth asking again. Why does every empire try to rewrite the past? Because whoever influences memory gains influence over the future.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.